Okay, let's start. Final reminder. Be sure you all know where you are supposed to be going for your final exam. And it is Monday at 12:30. Computers closed, please. Okay, in my last lecture, which was last Thursday, we were talking about the evidence that there is a switch that has to be flipped to go from one state of the human development to another state of human development, and particularly from going from childhood to adolescence. There's a radical change. And the onset of this change is what we call puberty. And puberty is the capability, the physical, biological capability of performing reproduction. And we said that this switch corresponds to a network of interacting cells, cells found in multiple parts of the body, all interacting with each other through chemical signals. This is not a homeostatic mechanism, negative feedback loop, but this is another example of a network of interacting cells producing a developmental switch, turning on a developmental event. And this event starts with the secretion of sex steroids from the gonads, which in turn is produced by the release of gonadotropins, LH and FSH, from the anterior pituitary, which in turn is caused by the release of gonadotropin release from the hypothalamus. A network that we have seen multiple times. Hypothalamus interacting with anterior pituitary, interacting with glands throughout the body to control, in this case, the release of the sex steroids. We also addressed the question, well, what is it that flips this switch? What starts the release of the gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the cells in the hypothalamus? What is it that's changing in kids that produces the ability to reproduce? It starts these changes going. And we said that it is related to the size of the child. And not necessarily size overall, but more specifically amount of fat. And this was discovered by the demonstration that fat cells release a hormone called leptin, which gets into the bloodstream and for which there are receptors on cells in the hypothalamus. And when leptin levels get high enough, the hypothalamic neurons get activated and this switch gets flipped. So the final determining event is the appearance of enough fat cells to release enough leptin to activate the hypothalamus. Yeah. That very logically follows, correct, and there is evidence for that. We're going to talk about that right now. It is observed that the age at which puberty occurs keeps getting younger and younger. 100 years ago, puberty started at 18 years of age. Now, 8 to 10 years of age, and puberty is starting. Why? Why is that? That is a good question. Well, the why answer to that question is sort of consistent with the observation that at younger ages nowadays, fat levels are increasing. Fat levels are increasing. Children are becoming fatter at younger and younger ages, and this is triggering the onset of puberty at younger and younger ages. And this is totally consistent with the topic of what I want to talk about in this final lecture. That is the appearance of there being an epidemic of obesity in our society today, and, which I hope to scare you all with, the fact that this is going to produce drastic health consequences for your generation, for subsequent generation, not just for your state of health, but for the state of the economy. Huge amounts of money are going to need to be spent because of this epidemic of obesity. Okay, so let's start with obesity. Generally, what do we mean by obesity? Obesity means too much fat. Not just overweight, as we'll say, not just being overweight, but having a significant amount of that weight, of that mass, being the result of fat cells. How do we go about measuring obesity? How do we go about measuring how much fat is present in a person's body? Well, the most accurate way of doing this is to determine the density of the body. In other words, submerge somebody into a pool of water and see how much the water level rises. Calculate the volume of the body. Volume of the body. Determine the weight of the body. From measurements of weight and volume, you get density. Fat cells are a lot less dense than muscle cells are. Okay, so that density is going to depend on the percent of fat in the body. And this gives fairly accurate measurements of the amount of fat. The problem with this method is it's very time-consuming, it's very costly. So there are other methods that are used to clinically and rapidly measure obesity. One of these is to use these body calipers, these pinchers. Take these pinchers and try and pinch different parts of the body where fat may accumulate. If fat is present in that part of the body, these pincers can come closer and closer together. If there is little fat, those pincers will not move close together, and you can accurately measure how much those pincers move. Okay? This is a second method, much more rapid than the first method, much cheaper for estimating the amount of fat in the body. The third method is even easier, and this is the one that is mostly used. It's easier and even cheaper. This entails determining what's called the body mass index. And this is a mathematical equation where all you need to determine is height and weight, things that are measured in every physical exam when you go to the doctor. And that value of height and weight is plugged into these equations, and the BMI is calculated. And the numerical value of the BMI is used to determine whether one is normal. Well, that normal is pretty thin to me. Overweight, obese, severely obese, or morbidly obese, based on the value of the BMI that could be very easily calculated. The BMI is easily calculated, but it is also the least accurate of the three methods for determining the amount of fat in the body. The scale is sort of a little bit arbitrary. One of the problems with BMI is that body fat never enters into the equation. It's just height and weight. And it is possible for two people, as shown in this figure here, for two people to have the exact same BMI, the exact same height and weight, but very different amounts of body fat. So you shouldn't always worry if your BMI, I think my BMI is about 28 or 29, you shouldn't necessarily worry about it all being fat, because this is solid muscle right here. Okay? So you have to be aware of the fact that the BMI is not necessarily measuring fat. But for a rough estimation, it is a good measure of the amount of fat. And if you measure the BMI of a population of people over a significant period of time, you can detect and use that method fairly well to detect changes, trends in the change of the BMI index, and suggest that this trend suggests trends and changes in the amount of obesity in the population. Okay, so here in red, we have measurements of BMI, the amount of the population that is obese. Okay, so today, actually it's a little higher recently, 5 years later, today 36% of the U.S. population is obese. 36% of the population population has a BMI of 30 or above. Is that a lot? Is that a little? All we can say, and all the important significance is, look at the trend. Not too many years ago, the number of obese people was much lower. A third of the amount, less than a half of the amount in the 1980s. Your parents' generation had much fewer obese people in it than our present, well, not necessarily the generation, but at that time, the adults were much less obese. And in regard to what we were talking about before, about childhood obesity and the early onset of puberty, the incidence of childhood obesity is increasing at even a more rapid rate. Okay? So there is no doubt that the incidence of obesity is increasing. This has great consequences because obesity is associated with, and I'm very careful with my words here, associated with many other diseases. Does this mean that obesity causes many other diseases? Many, but we do not necessarily have the evidence to show it. Associated with means when one increases, the other increases. But it does not necessarily say that an increase in obesity is going to cause an increase in all these other diseases. There are many other consequences of being obese. Today, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about particularly the link between obesity and diabetes. We will see that the cost, the medical cost of obesity right now is already hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's been estimated that each taxpayer, any of you are paying taxes, each taxpayer contributes more than $1,000, maybe up to $2,000 per year to treating the consequences of obesity. So it's costing you. It comes out of your pockets. Now, we have spent this entire semester talking about how well-regulated biological systems are, how amazing this homeostasis is, all these homeostatic mechanisms, networks of interacting cells that are designed to keep and maintain the internal environment at a constant and optimum level. And how wonderful these biological systems are. Well, where are these biological systems today? Where are these homeostatic mechanisms today that regulate weight? If the population, the amount of obesity in a population is increasing, that raises the question, what are the causes of this increase in obesity? First of all, do we have homeostatic mechanisms that regulate body weight, that keep body weight at a constant value? In other words, there is a set point for each of us as individuals where our body weight is supposed to be maintained. And if it goes above it, there are changes. If it goes below it, there are changes. Are there such homeostatic mechanisms? And if there are, why are they not working? Because it is quite apparent that they must not be working or not performing that kind of homeostatic regulation. Another possibility, maybe there is a mutation. Some gene has changed, which is now producing a loss of our ability to regulate our body weight. This is highly unlikely because this change has occurred over such a short period of time. For genes to spread, a new mutated gene to spread throughout a population, in other words, for evolution to occur, usually takes much longer periods of time. So it's not likely that there is a single mutation that is responsible for this increase in obesity. Could it be that something has changed in our environment? Is there a new pathogen which affects our ability to regulate our body weight? Is there some change in our lifestyle that has destroyed our ability to regulate our body weight? These are questions that we will start addressing in terms of trying to find why do we have this increase in obesity. Okay, first of all, do we have homeostatic mechanisms that regulate the weight of the body? And the answer for that seems to be that yes, we do. Or at least animal models that are to almost exactly the previous level that it was. So we can say starvation experiments. After food deprivation, there is a decrease in fat and weight, return to free access of food, and body weight returns to original value. This suggests that there is some kind of homeostatic mechanism. It returns to what it was before. It doesn't keep increasing and go on and on and on and on. You can do the exact opposite experiment. The exact opposite experiment is stuffing food into the animals, essentially force feeding them. So you give them extra food. And as expected, weight increases, levels of fat increase. You're force feeding them. After the fat levels have increased, you stop force feeding them, and you again give them free access to the food that they can eat. And what happens? Their weight drops. Their fat levels drop. Body weight returns to the original value. So the original value, the original body weight of these animals before these experiments was held at some optimum value. And it returns to that optimum value after you do these very severe experimental manipulations. So, in some way, there must be a homeostatic mechanism that regulates body weight by doing several things. What are the effectors? What could these homeostatic mechanisms be doing? They can be controlling, uses effectors. They can control how much we eat. So if your body weight is above an optimum level, as in the force-fed animals, they'll eat less, even though all the food they want is available. The body weight is below the optimum level. They will eat more until they bring their body weight up. Okay? Now, what determines how much we eat? Well, there are multiple components to this. One is what we can call our conscious subjective experiences. What we feel. How do we feel about our food and ourselves? Are we hungry? Hunger is a feeling. It's a subjective experience. It's something that's going on in your head. That means it's the result of what? Everything going on in your head. What produces your thoughts? Signals where? What kind of network? Right, it's a result of signals flowing through a neuronal network. If you are hungry, that feeling of being hungry is a result of signals flowing through some network. The opposite of hunger, if you're full, satiated, you have a feeling of being full. It's a feeling in your head. It's the result of signals flowing through a neuronal network. Whether you feel hungry or whether you feel full will influence how much you eat. We also have how much we eat determined by motor behaviors. Motor behavior, movement. What controls how we move? I'm supposed to be reviewing parts of the semester here. What determines how much we move? What parts of the body produce your movement? Muscles. Changes and contraction of muscles, which is determined by the flow of signals through neuronal networks involving motor neurons. Okay? Motor behavior, whether we spend time searching for food or whether we just sit in front of the TV set. Whether you go out and look for food or not. Another example of motor behavior, the nervous system. What part of the brain is most likely to be involved in regulating body weight, something which is essential for survival? I can't hear you, louder. No. Next step up. The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus. Talked about this the last 2 times. The hypothalamus is the most important part of the brain for determining behaviors that are essential for biological survival. Is the hypothalamus, as shown here, just a tiny little part of the brain, does the hypothalamus regulate how much we eat? Is the hypothalamus consistent with this idea that it's essential for survival? Well, small as it looks in this picture, the hypothalamus actually has multiple parts when zoomed in at a higher magnification. We can do experiments that demonstrate whether a certain part of the brain is performing a particular function. Anybody remember the kinds of experiments that we used to determine the function in certain parts of the cerebral cortex? MRI, as we talked about it, determines structure. What would you be looking for? continue with that. Abnormalities, what we call lesions. Remember when we talked about language? Go back and look at that lecture. Language. We said that language functions are localized to certain parts of the cerebral cortex, and we knew that because in people with damage to those parts of the cortex, they lost certain language abilities. Well, now the question is, what happens to people who have damage in some of these very small parts of the hypothalamus? Okay? Is this likely to produce any particular change in their ability to regulate body weight? Okay, so we'll just give it a number. Part 1. We won't go worrying about the long Latin names. There is one part of the hypothalamus. Part 1 of the hypothalamus. When there is a lesion, that means that part of the brain is destroyed, but surrounding parts are all right. There is a loss of weight, decreased appetite. When one very, very small part of the brain is damaged. From this observation, what is the normal function of part 1 in the hypothalamus? Destroying, removing these parts of the brain, loss of weight, decreased appetite. You feel full all the time. You're not hungry. What is the normal function? Maintenance of weight, but more specifically, yes, this part of the brain, normally, when it's active, tends to make you hungry and tends to increase activity, increase eating. So activity in these parts of the brain, hunger, eat more. Remove that part of the brain, and you can't produce hunger. You don't eat more, you eat less. Decrease appetite, loss of weight. Okay? There's a second part of the hypothalamus, which has just the opposite. When that part is lesioned, you get gain of weight, overeating, obesity, damage to one small part of the brain could produce obesity. Does this mean that in this population, the American population, where obesity is increasing, is something happening to the brains and the hypothalamus of everybody to make everybody obese? I don't think so. Unless you're paranoid and seem to think that aliens or the government is some way manipulating the brains of newborn children to remove or damage this part of the hypothalamus. I like science fiction, but not likely. Okay, so you damage this part of the brain and weight is gained, overeating, and obesity. Okay, what is the normal function of number 2? Right, normal function. This is the part of the brain that tells you, stop eating. This is the part of the brain that gives you the feeling of being full. Normally. So I want you to get used to thinking about this way. If you destroy or remove a part of the brain and it produces certain symptoms, what does this tell you about the normal function of that brain, of that part of the brain? Usually just the opposite. But this has shown, these studies have shown, that the hypothalamus has two roles, two parts of the hypothalamus with opposite functions. One that produces hunger and increased eating, overeating. One that produces the feeling of being full and decreased eating. Two opposite functions of two parts of the brain. No. It would be nice if they did. Most diet pills increase metabolism in general. Amphetamines make you metabolize and go through things faster. In the future, maybe, with knowledge of this, we'll be able to target better drugs, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, this tells us that the brain, or particularly the hypothalamus, must be receiving some signal, some information from the body, okay? Providing information about body weight, energy balance, how much you should eat, how much you shouldn't eat. The hypothalamus is making the decisions. It needs to make that decision based on information. What is that information? Where is that information coming from? Okay? Well, we're going to talk about, I'm going to go through three possible ways in which the hypothalamus, or we can use to regulate body weight. One is the amount of fat in the body. Another is through the digestive system. And the third is through blood glucose levels. Three possible ways in which hypothalamus can get information about what's happening out in the body. How much weight is present? How big is the body? Okay? Now, from what we know about what starts puberty, we know that there is communication between fat cells in the body and the hypothalamus. We know that when there is enough fat in the body, a hormone secreted by the fat cells, leptin, activates the hypothalamus, but not involved in this. We don't know yet whether it affects body weight, but we know it starts those sequence of changes that are going to result in the increase of the sex hormones and the onset of puberty. So yes, fat can interact with the hypothalamus. Insight, some ideas about how fat leading to regulation of body weight can interact with the hypothalamus was obtained by studying an unusual strain of mice. This is an example of a very obese mouse next to a normal mouse. Which one would you rather cuddle and hold in your hand? Huh? The obese one? How many would like the obese one better? Yeah, there's nothing wrong with being obese. Obese mice are cute. All right. Now, this strain of obese mice arose from a mutation in one gene. A mutation in one gene led to this particular strain of mouse. Molecular analysis of the gene product. The gene product, remember, 2 steps is a protein. There is a protein found in the blood of these obese mice at much, much higher levels than the level of that protein is in the normal mice. Okay? It was demonstrated that this protein arose from transcription. Anybody remember what transcription of a gene is? What happens when you transcribe a gene? You got a final coming up. This is a kind of simple question that can be on the final. What is transcription of a gene?
Creates mRNA.
Copying, yes. Transcribing, copying it into what? RNA, a messenger RNA. Transcription. Then that messenger RNA is translated into a protein which is secreted into the blood. Translation. Remember, that uses the ribosomes to synthesize the protein from the messenger RNA. However, it was found that the transcription of the messenger RNA and transcription of the gene into messenger RNA, the translation of the gene, all this occurred in fat cells. Okay? So, fat cells have a gene expressed in them. Gene expressed in them. I think I just told you something wrong. Okay, in the mutants, there is decreased amount of this protein that is present at higher levels in normal mice. So the fat mice, when this gene is mutated, have lost the protein that's normally in the blood and missing, but in normal mice is present. And this protein is synthesized and made in fat cells. Okay? Now, what was found was that this protein is the exact same as the hormone we were talking about before, leptin. And in this case, though, what leptin is doing is interacting with the hypothalamus normally when there is enough fat present, when body weight is normal, there's enough fat present, leptin is being released, the part of the hypothalamus is activated that suppresses eating. So you don't eat as much when there is enough fat in the body because leptin is inhibiting that part of the hypothalamus. Now in this mutant mouse, unfortunately, is not making leptin. This mutant mouse has that part of the brain in the hypothalamus overactive. It's overactive. It keeps eating and eating and eating. Fat builds up and builds up, but that fat is not releasing leptin, which is being communicated to the hypothalamus, normally saying, stop eating already, I got enough fat, I have enough leptin. In this mutant, there's not enough, their leptin levels are low, the hypothalamus can't be regulated, and it can't activate. Okay? Reduced fat, body weight increases, leptin increases, interacts with the hypothalamus in the brain, decreased food intake. If in this mutation there is no leptin, the the weight is going to, animal is going to keep eating and eating and eating, and more fat is going to develop. Now, this experiment was first discovered on mice. Said, whoa, maybe humans have a gene like this. And they do. Humans have a leptin gene. This led to the idea, well, maybe obesity in humans is due to a mutation in the leptin gene. And the hypothalamus is just telling these people to keep eating and eating and eating. If this was the case, how could you treat obesity in people who had a mutation in this leptin gene? Provide them with what? Provide them with leptin. If they have a mutation and can't make leptin, no matter how much their fat cells don't make leptin, what happens if we inject them with leptin? Okay? Then you can turn the hypothalamus off and they stop eating. So this was very exciting. Drug companies thought, oh, I'm going to make billions on this. I'm going to sell leptin to everybody. Unfortunately, less than 10%, well, need way less than 10% of the obese population respond to injecting leptin. So yes, there's a very small number of people who have mutations in the leptin gene, which produces their obesity, which can be treated by injecting them with leptin. But for most of them, that doesn't work. Second thing we were going to look at was, other than the hypothalamus, what about the digestive system? Does the digestive system provide information to the brain about how much you have been eating? And the answer to that is yes. Your digestive system secretes hormones, just like almost every single part of the body. When the stomach is empty, a hormone is released, ghrelin, that interacts with the brain. The stomach is communicating with the brain, saying, I am empty. Fill me up. Ghrelin interacts with the brain and it makes the feeling of being hungry and increases eating. Okay. The small intestine communicates with the brain. In this case, the small intestine, after meals, when there is food in it, secretes a hormone, PYY, which interacts with the brain and is shown it's red here. It inhibits feeding, suppresses appetite. This is plenty of food in my small intestine. Do not put any more in your mouth. Stop eating. They're communicating with each other, these parts of the brain. Yeah, you have a question?
What does the thyroid have to do with anything?
Thyroid isn't involved in this at all. But the thyroid can affect body weight because what the thyroid does is affect the overall metabolic rate of the body. How fast you're undergoing metabolism. Okay? But it's not specific for what your weight should be. Yeah? Yes, and that would have just as bad effect if there was something, if there was a mutation in the receptor. A mutation in the receptor, so that the receptor doesn't work, would have just as bad effect as if the hormone is not present. Okay? So that could be tested. And here again shows that leptin from fat cells inhibits hunger. Insulin also, in addition to its role in mediating glucose also affects the brain and has the ability to suppress hunger. Blood glucose goes up, enough food in the body, stop eating. Multiple systems performing the same function. This is what we call redundancy. Redundancy in biological systems is a common observance when something is very important to get done. You do it in multiple ways. In case one of them goes wrong, then some of these other ways can carry on. Okay, now, why does it appear as though these homeostatic mechanisms that we've talked about, leptin communicating with the brain, digestive tract communicating the brain, why aren't these enough to regulate our body weight? Okay? And the reason for that is that our homeostatic mechanisms, which we have and animals have, evolved to meet a very different situation from that which exists today. In the past, consistent supply of food was rare. You'd have to go sometimes long periods without having food. That's almost unheard of today. All you have to do is open up your refrigerator, go to the corner store, and you get all the food you want. In the past, most meals were of low calorie content. Fruit and vegetables, only rarely, when a hunt was successful, did you have a meal that consisted of fatty meat, high calorie content, rare and very desirable. Okay? It was a benefit in the past to crave fatty and sweet foods because they had high calories. And when they were available, everybody grabbed and ate as much of it as they could. And that was of benefit. It was a benefit to have mechanisms that enabled you to convert extra food, if you had any, to a storage form, and to get as much high-calorie food as possible because it wasn't always available. In the past, this is what you needed to do in order to survive. This is what our homeostatic mechanisms evolved to do, to help us survive under these kinds of situations. What do when we're faced with starvation? We do have several mechanisms which specifically help us survive long periods without food. Okay? So, how many of you have not eaten in the last 12 hours? Nobody. Oh, you're all very good. Well, if you want to try an experiment, go 12 hours without eating. Your body can handle it. No damage at all. What your body will do, if you don't have any nutrients coming in for 12 hours, it will break down the existing glycogen present in your liver and in your muscles. Remember, from the previous meal, when you had extra glucose as a result of insulin, it's taken up into the liver, taken up into the muscle, and stored as glycogen. You can deplete your glycogen. You'll last for about a 12-hour fast by depleting most of the glycogen in your body. Anybody ever done a fast for more than 12 hours? A multiple day fast? Or a whole day fast? Nobody? Should try it. It's a good experiment. Come on, you got to discover what your body can do and what it feels like when you do these unusual things. Okay? If you go longer than 12 hours without eating, your body starts breaking down fat. This is what everybody wants to do, lose fat cells. But go for at least 12 hours without food and the fat cells start breaking down. This fat breaks down into molecular components that are taken up by the liver and synthesize new glucose molecules. Gluconeogenesis. Gluco for glucose, new glucose molecules made, synthesized as a result of the breakdown of fat from the fat cells. Okay, this will keep you going, alive, for several days. Several days you can survive without eating by breaking down your fat cells. This is why, in some cultures and in the past, fat was good. People who were fat were more likely to survive longer periods of time without any food coming in. It's good to have these mechanisms where you make fat and have a lot of fat. Now, what if you're in really bad times and you go several weeks without food? Well, you have mechanisms to try to keep the blood glucose high, and you do that this time by breaking down proteins. Proteins break down into what are their constituent components? Amino acids. Amino acids can be taken up by the liver and used to synthesize glucose. And this could keep you alive for a couple of months, maybe. There have been some examples of some of the best starvers have been IRA prisoners. You know, the radical Irish Republican Army in British jails, they used to go on hunger strikes, refusing to eat. Some of them survived 50, 60 days without eating. What happens? The final stage, proteins start getting broken down from all parts of their body and used to synthesize glucose. But what happens as proteins break down? Proteins are needed for the normal functioning of every part of your body.
So type 1 diabetes, which is often called juvenile diabetes, often arises from a mutation in a gene for insulin, or more likely, an autoimmune attack. You start making antibodies to your pancreas. So that the pancreatic cells cannot make insulin anymore. So type 1 diabetes, no insulin production. And this affects about 1 out of every 800 people in the U.S. population, and is maintained and treated by insulin injections. The incidence of type 1 diabetes has stayed about the same. This is not the cause of, as we'll see, the current epidemic in diabetes that is associated with the epidemic of obesity. The second type of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, again has high levels of glucose in the blood, much higher levels. But insulin is being secreted when blood levels are high. It's not because of a lack of insulin. So insulin is being released, but the glucose is not being taken up into the other tissues. What's happening? Well, we say it's the result of an insulin resistance. The cells here are not responding to insulin. Insulin is supposed to increase the ability of these cells to take up glucose. Something is going wrong with these cells, their ability to respond to the insulin. Okay, this type of type 2 diabetes affects right now about 21 million people in the U.S. That number is increasing. Okay, here it stopped at 2007 and it wasn't even 21. Now it's up to about here. 21 million people have this type 2 diabetes. $9 a year to treat increasing. About 80% of the diabetics are obese. Not everybody who's overweight, only about 30% of the overweight people get diabetes. So it's not like saying, well, you're obese, you're going to get diabetes. It's not a guaranteed thing. But it's an increased risk, increased chance of it happening. What are we going to do about this? What's the best way to handle this epidemic of diabetes, this epidemic of obesity, and the huge cost it's going to be? It is right now to society, and it's going to be more. Well, the answer is very easy. Using physical principles, energy in equals energy out, and anything extra goes to increase weight, anything extra in the other direction loses weight. The best way to treat this epidemic is to diet and exercise. And sure enough, diet and exercise are both billion-dollar industries in this country. Everybody wants to diet. Everybody wants to exercise. And you pay money to do that. But it's not working. People don't like to restrain their food. We're built in to have this craving for fat and sweet food. It's just built into it. It's very hard to overcome that. And it can't overcome that biological mechanism. We get very little positive feedback that encourages us to do this. It's hard to stick to diets. And exercise by itself is not enough to do it. So there is a great need for research. Research to study how we can manipulate and use these homeostatic mechanisms that we have to manipulate them and help people lose weight and not become diabetic. The dream drug would be a drug that lets you eat all that you want and not gain weight, not get diabetes. And tell the truth, the drug companies are spending billions of dollars to do that. And some of the best hints on how they're going to do this, how they're going to solve that, comes about from this link between obesity and diabetes. What is the link here? How does this thing interact with each other? This suggests that there is a linkage between the presence of fat cells, the amount of fat, and insulin resistance. Remember insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. They don't respond to insulin. in some way, the presence of fat leads to this insulin resistance. How could it do that? That means that fat cells have the ability to interact with every other cell in your body. How could they do that? A hormone. Maybe there's a hormone. Maybe there's some chemical signal released from fat cells that interacts with every other cell in the body and affects their ability to respond to insulin. And well, I wouldn't have mentioned it unless it's been discovered. And there is. There is a hormone called Adiptonectin. Adipo for fat. Adiptonectin released from fat cells. When these fat cells release this hormone interacts with all parts of the body, and it works together with insulin. It increases insulin sensitivity. In other words, insulin by itself is not sufficient. This hormone from fat cells is needed to make these tissues insulin sensitive. Okay, you're going to have to work out the logic of this on your own. Now, what's found in people who are obese? They're obese. There's more fat cells, but something strange happens. This hormone decreases. In other words, when there's lots of fat, there's less adiponectin being released. Less adiponectin. If there is no or less adiponectin, that means these cells are not able to respond